The plenary session is going to be taken by Aaron Sloman from the University of Birmingham. And the title of the talk is Recently Hatched Ideas about Hatching an Intelligence Using Very Low Energy Physics and Chemistry to Normal Temperatures in Egg-Laying Vertebrates. So I'll ask Aaron to take the chair. And the reason you have a sort of strange display on your computer is that he's sharing his desktop with us, not a series of slides. So you get a kind of double effect going on. Don't worry about it. It's just a bit surreal.
Yes, and at the moment I'm just letting it show who's speaking, and so you'll see me because I'm speaking, but I'll move into another mode fairly soon. I just want to say I want to apologize because I've agreed to do this despite knowing that the task is impossible in the time available. But I'll see what happens. Maybe I can plant some seeds in people's minds and then they'll grow and people will come back to me later and so on. But let's go to my webpage for a start, which has a title. Well, you've heard it now. Recently hatched ideas about hatching an intelligence, and there's a subtitle, using very low energy physics and chemistry at normal temperatures in egg-laying vertebrates. So you get a clue from that I'm talking about intelligence that's concerned with space. And although I'm focusing on animals, vertebrate animals that lay eggs, I'm really interested in human intelligence and all sorts of other kinds of intelligence. But by narrowing it down, we can isolate some features of the problem that are otherwise obscured by too many other factors. So, and I only thought of doing this, although I've been working on this problem since about 1960, when I was finishing off my DPhil thesis defending Immanuel Kant in Oxford. And I've done many talks and many papers and done things. It was only in October, around October 2020, that I suddenly thought, animals come out of eggs. Many sorts of birds, but not only birds, turtles, alligators, various other things come out of eggs. Not only fully formed physically, they can walk, they can go to their mother, they can feed themselves and so on, but also with surprising amounts of intelligence. They don't have to go and train neural nets in order to work out which foot to move when or how to peck at food. They already have those competences. And that thought had never previously struck me in the way that it did. It somehow was triggered by an event or a remark in a conference I was listening to, as yet another Zoom conference. So after that, I started thinking about eggs and what could happen inside an egg. And the more I thought about it, the more complex the problem got. And you're going to have a taste of some of that journey into increasing complexity that I've been through in the last couple of years. How shall I start? Well, I'll give a tiny bit of background to explain my original motivation. When I was a student studying mathematics in Oxford, I discovered that a lot of people thought that Immanuel Kant's philosophy of mathematics was completely wrong and that David Hume was right. And I had previously read about Kant, partly through Bertrand Russell's book, The History of Western Philosophy, and felt that Immanuel Kant's views corresponded to my experience. But now here's the catch. My experience went back to my days at school when I was taught geometry. We had school teachers who drew diagrams on boards and showed you how you could construct new diagrams with rulers and compasses. The diagrams themselves did not have to be perfect. That was a key point. The things that were drawn represented abstract things which were in our minds that we could think about, and we could learn things from those diagrams. And that was my favorite part of mathematics at that time. Then I went to university, originally planning to do physics, switched into mathematics for various reasons, and then started learning about other kinds of mathematics, which are much more formal, logic-based, and so on. But the geometric mathematics was still there in the background, and I was still interested in it. Then I started meeting philosophers who thought that there was something wrong with the kind of view of Immanuel Kant that I had liked. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up different bits of the history. They thought Immanuel Kant had been refuted by Einstein and Eddington. Einstein's contribution was pointing out that there's a reason to believe that physical space is not Euclidean, therefore wouldn't satisfy Euclidean axioms. And then Eddington in 1919 observed eclipse of the sun. I'm hoping most people know what happened. By using an eclipse, they could get light from a star coming close to the sun, which would not normally be visible during an eclipse, and compare the position of that star relative to the other stars where there's no eclipse. And then the predicted shift was observed. The star looked a bit further away from the sun when during the eclipse because the light was coming close to the sun. Anyway, the details don't matter. The point was that was supposed to show that Einstein's view of space as non-Euclidean, of physical space as non-Euclidean, was correct. And many people then drew the conclusion that Immanuel Kant had been refuted because he thought we could have knowledge about Euclidean geometry that we got by thinking about diagrams and reasoning. We could use rulers and pencils and compasses and so on, but those are just tools, and the precise operation of those was not important. You didn't have to you couldn't have a perfectly thin pencil line anyway. I mean, that's physically impossible, but you could reason about perfectly thin lines and use the physical diagrams to suggest lines of argument. And that had been going on not only for hundreds of years, but for hundreds of years before Euclid and Aristotle and Plato and Pythagoras. Pythagoras' theorem was proved many times long before Pythagoras was born. The theorem was discovered. Anyway, should I click on admit because there's someone in the waiting room? I'll do that. Anyway, so that was part of the background to all of this. I liked geometry. I thought Immanuel Kant had made some deep points about the nature of human geometric knowledge, and they corresponded to my experience as a student in geometry. And now I was encountered by lots of people saying Kant's been refuted by Einstein and Eddington, and the education of young kids in schools changed for the worst in most countries in the world. Instead of learning to do geometry the way that I had been doing, they might learn a bit of it, but mostly they were taught set theory and logic. And then if they got into geometry, it was done in a purely axiomatic way. Here are some axioms for geometry, and then this is what you can derive from those axioms using the logic that you've already learned. And that's not how the original geometry was discovered. They didn't start from axioms. The axioms were abstracted from the discoveries. Anyway, that's background. And I will just give you a little example, which I like because it's a theorem that is normally proved by using a diagram that's either made up like this or bits of this. Name the theorem says that if you have a triangle ABC, the three internal angles A, B, and C add up to 180 degrees, namely a straight line. And there are various ways of proving it, standard ways, but they all involve parallel lines. One way is to draw a parallel line over there, parallel to this, and then you show that these three angles are parallel to these three, add up to the same as that angle, that angle, that angle, because this angle corresponds to that angle because of the parallel lines and so on. I don't want to go through all the tedious details. The point is, this made use of axioms of Euclidean geometry, and you can do it in various different ways. But a former student who had been doing philosophy and maths at Birmingham University, became a school teacher. Her name was Mary Pardo. One day knocked on my door and asked me if she could have a chat. I was pleased to see her, and I asked her what she wanted to talk about. And she told me that she had found that her students found this proof difficult to understand. So she had come up with another proof, and she wanted to know if it was okay. So I will now show you Mary's proof. If I can, I think the easiest way is to just do it with a pencil. Mary's proof said, if you want to prove that three angles of a triangle add up to a straight line, put a pencil on one of the sides of the triangle, then rotate it through one of the angles, and then rotate it through the second angle to get to the third side, and then rotate it to the final angle to get to the original side. And no matter what the shape of the triangle, you can see that that process will go through one angle, another angle, and end up where it's started. So the whole rotation of the pencil is 180 degrees. And I thought that was a wonderful proof, even though it wasn't in any of the textbooks I'd encountered. I later reported that to a mailing list on Foundations of Mathematics, and the people there were split. Some thought it was a nice new proof. Some thought it was not a valid proof for whatever reasons. We needn't go into that. And I later then discovered, someone wrote to me after I put a website on about this, that Mary wasn't the first person to discover that proof. It had been discovered by, I think, a French or Italian mathematician a couple of 100 years earlier, and it generated a lot of controversy. Anyway, that to me is an illustration of real mathematical discovery using space to reason about space. And there's an awful lot of that you can find online on the internet. And there are many brilliant lectures showing how you can prove things. But that's the end of that for now, because I have to now go on to what this has to do with brains and eggs and so on. Part of my problem is remembering the sequence in which I've prepared things. So let's go back to the talk. So that was a debate between Hume and Kant, and I thought Kant was right. David Hume has essentially claimed there are only two kinds of knowledge, namely knowledge that comes from logic and definitions, which Kant called analytic, and then the rest is empirical. And the only way you could discover the truth or falsity of empirical claims was to go and examine the world. And Kant was saying, no, there's three kinds, and Hume hadn't noticed that. Now, I suspect that if Hume and Kant had had a conversation, Hume would have agreed with Kant and said, yes, of course, I've learned all that stuff, and I just wasn't thinking about it when I made my claim about two kinds of knowledge, because the second kind, which is not empirical, I should have pointed out, as you have, breaks down into two subcategories. Anyway, that's Kant and Hume. Now, I've thought that for a long time that the ancient human abilities to make these mathematical discoveries were somehow related to biological capabilities, which are shared with many intelligent species. And some of that is something that I'm going to talk about in a strange way. Oh, by the way, one of the key points I need to point out is that the phenomena that I'm talking about, the discoveries that I'm talking about, cannot come out of the operation of neural networks, which collect a lot of statistical data and then derive probabilities. Why not? Because when you make these mathematical discoveries, you're discovering that something is impossible or that it has to be the case. It's necessarily true. You may also make statistical discoveries in mathematics. That's just a sub-branch of mathematics. But the statistic-based neural networks, there are complications and qualifications I should put in, because there are hybrid neural networks, which wouldn't probably be covered precisely by what I'm saying. But the paradigm is that the core paradigm of neural networks is they collect a lot of statistical data and then they derive probabilities. And I'm saying out of that, you will never get the ancient kind of mathematical knowledge. you will get something different. So they're constitutionally incapable of explaining the forms of spatial cognition that ancient mathematicians have, and which I believe many other animals also have, and they use it in their interactions with the environment. And I think the next thing I should show you is some birds. The question is, where have I put them? I think I've put them, yeah. So last year, around June, the BBC have a program every year called Spring Watch, and they have wonderful people with wonderful apparatus recording behaviors of many kinds of animals in many different environments, and a lot of them involve birds because they're so fascinating and so varied. And last June, they were showing some avocets. That's an avocet you see on my screen, who had recently hatched, and then when coming out, they walked around a bit, they'd been with their mother, and then at one point, the mother went in one direction, and the young birds went in the opposite direction to some water and started paddling. And I said, oh, I wish I had a video of that. My wife said, freeze the video, freeze the television, get your camera out, go back and take a video of the portion you wanted, which I did. So I'm now going to show you without any sound, because I'll tell you what's going on, what I captured on the screen. So that's a mother avocet, and those are some newly hatched and some not yet hatched ones. And then slightly later, we see her again, and I don't know exactly what's going on there, but there are these 4 hatchlings. She goes left, they go right, they go to the water. And then they start walking into the water, and now you see them paddling around, pecking and feeding themselves. And this is, I presume, very shortly after they had hatched. I mean, I've known for years, and probably many people have known, that when chicks come out of eggs, they can do things. They can go and walk and so on. But it's not only chicks, there are many species. And I'm now focusing on vertebrate species because there are other things that use eggs and all kinds of things that are interestingly different. And so everything I say about eggs now is about vertebrates. And that includes a whole lot of reptiles and birds and other things, snakes of various sorts. Well, they're reptiles. So the question is, what could go on inside eggs to enable their brains to have these competences when they come out of the eggs almost immediately, if not, in a fraction of a second after coming out, very shortly after, and without having to go through a long, tedious process of training their brains using statistics and deriving probability. So that's the question: how could it work? And the suggestion, which is in its way totally wild, is that evolution had discovered ways of solving problems which it fed into ancestors, or it allowed ancestors of these animals to discover, and mechanisms in eggs allowed discoveries made by ancestors to be, and the original discoveries might have been made slowly, tediously, lots of trial and error, lots of statistical learning or whatever, but it's somehow what had been learned got encoded in the genome, and that raised the question, how is it encoded, and how is the information put into the brain of or put into somehow the space occupied by a new animal that's developing inside an egg. And I will try to show you some ideas which have been developing in the last year and a half and accelerating in the last 6 months, expanding on that idea. because it's very complicated. There's still a lot that's very speculative, and it may be that it's all completely wrong, in which case I hope people who know why it's wrong will tell me, and then we can find a better theory. So the next question is, what do I do next? I had something prepared. I think I've said all that. Right. Skip to the Evo-Devo diagrams below. So I'm now going to try to summarize the ideas that I've been thinking about over the last 2 years, and especially in the last 6 months, which are really very complicated and hard to explain. And I'm going to use a few diagrams. In my previous talks, I collapsed all the diagrams into one. So if anyone's here who's seen this before, you'll see a difference. So this is a diagram. The idea for this diagram came from Susan Stepney. I don't know if she's here today, but she's in the University of York, and we've known each other for a long time, and she's heard me talk, and we've interacted. But anyway, she heard of an early version of this theory and came up with the idea that it could be represented in a 2D diagram. And she did a very crude pencil sketch, and I took her idea and then enriched it in many ways. So this is the latest version of Susan's idea. So we have an abstract screen of a space of possibilities for change in a biological organism. And one dimension of change is evolution across generations of species. And another dimension of change is development of an individual. And what's going to happen is that the development of the individual changes will be changed by the evolutionary changes. So we have changes in evolution, changes in development. And that's what I'm going to talk about for a while. So in the early days, this is very schematic, very abstract, and almost certainly wrong in detail. At some point in evolution of vertebrate egg-laying species, and that in itself is only a tiny sub-branch of the whole huge space of biological species about which Lynn Margulis writes wonderfully, if you know her work. Anyway, so this is partly inspired by her, but I don't know that she would agree with any of this. But so in the space, in the early days, there was at some point a simple, relatively simple kind of egg cell for a relatively simple kind of organism, which went through a hatching process in the egg, and then somehow that produced a new organism that continued growing when it came out of the egg, and that produced adults, and then adults could be male and female. And this is absolutely crucial. Everything I say today depends on sexual reproduction. Some of them male, some female, and then some of them would mate, and then inside female, a new eggs would be produced, and then those eggs would go through some internal processes, and then something would be born, and then cycle would continue. So that's a process of development at an early stage of evolution. Now we go down to figure B, and I've introduced, after a jump, a later stage of evolution, and I'm going to talk about some of the changes that might have occurred there. So at these later stages, what I'm suggesting is that the more evolved species of egg-laying animal went through more complicated stages of development, which corresponded to, which had intermediate stages that corresponded to previous stages of evolution. So we have something that in the genome, when the egg starts hatching, the DNA starts subdividing and so on, we get some little creature beginning to form inside the egg. And in this, and then that hatches, and then you get something walking around as of there. But in later stages, instead of the thing stopping at that point, it continues developing inside the egg to something more complicated, and VM is a label for virtual machine. Something is controlling, virtual machinery is controlling the chemical reassembly processes that are producing the physiological structures and all the mechanisms that are required for this thing eventually to go through the stages, including maybe more than one level of virtual machinery you're controlling, goes through various stages of building physiological structures and other things which enable it to come out of the egg and then start acting in the environment in a relatively competent way. And then at a still later stage, we have a much more complicated species where in the fairly early stages, something more complex comes, starts operating, and it goes through more complex layers of this versions of the sorts of things I've been talking about, namely constructions inside the egg, including constructions that are producing new constructions in the egg, which start developing new features, it could be new skeletal structures, new muscular structures, and also new evolving gene expression structures, so new recently evolved gene expression structures, which produce yet more complexity in, say, the current versions of the species. Now, that is very abstract, very schematic, and it would really need to be cashed out in terms of real biochemistry based on research that I'm not in a position to do. I don't have the resources, but I think there are many fragments already being done by researchers all over the planet studying various processes that go on in eggs and during the hatching process. And there are, if you go online and look for, search for information about eggs and hatching, you'll find that there are quite a lot of pictures. I don't know if I've got some here. Anyway, the main point I want to make is there are a lot of pictures showing different stages of development of a cross-section, say, of a chicken or a duck as during the hatching process. And those images and the commentaries cannot show you anything about the processes that are assembling the processes that are assembling the I clicked on a star by accident and I've done something else by accident. Anyway, those processes that go on inside that are shown by photographs taken by cutting open eggs where the fetuses are different stages of development, they don't show you the real intricate detail of the assembly that's been going on. All the blood vessels, all the nerve fibers, and the blood vessels are of different sorts. They're the veins being developed, which take stuff back to the heart and lung. The arteries, which will, as they begin to function, will be bringing blood pumped from the heart and out into various parts of the organism. Then there are the capillary vessels where the arteries subdivide and go into all sorts of physiological structures, and there they meet capillary vessels which are connected to the veins, which are going to take the byproducts of the interactions of the blood coming through the arteries with the environment, and there'll be byproducts like carbon dioxide and waste products and so on, which the veins collect and carry back. That's very intricate stuff, and all of that is going at the same time as there are nerve fibers all of that is being developed at the same time as there are nerve fibers being developed. There are tendons being developed, there are bone structures being developed, there are muscles being developed, and I could go on, all the parts of the digestive system and so on. All of these things are growing in parallel, and this is supposed to represent how some of the extra complexity at different stages in the development has to be controlled by more complex controlling virtual machinery. And I say it's virtual machinery because there's no space inside the eggs for all sorts of levers and arms and mechanical devices to come in and manipulate things. It has to be done perhaps by using electrical or electromagnetic fields or something like that, that doesn't occupy space in competition with the chemical structures and all the other things that are being built by the process. So the idea then is that evolution discovered ways of producing at later stages of development in species that reproduce using eggs. And again, I'm only talking about vertebrates here. It discovered ways of getting out of the genome at different stages, not only different information about what has to be in the developing organism, but also information about what kind of control system is required to coordinate and control the later stages of development, because the problems in the later stages will be more complex, more intricate than the problems of control in the earlier stages, when you've already got a lot of stuff developed, and then you now have to add more things. The control problems are different. So, and the abilities to do that controlling had to evolve and somehow get into the genome of the egg and then somehow be expressed. So that's the collection of ideas that I've been trying to present in talks in the last few months to various people, with the talks gradually getting wilder and more complex. And the hunch is that some of the spatial intelligence that was originally required for assembling complex structures inside developing organisms somehow got reused as spatial intelligence for acting and in an external environment and manipulating objects in the environment. So the conjecture is that evolution produced mechanisms for manipulating bits of biological evolutions which are being assembled and have to satisfy a whole variety of changing spatial relationships during the assembly. And out of that process came abilities that were later transferred to abilities to control and manipulate objects outside the organism. That's the conjecture. Of course, there would have to be a whole lot of intermediate stages and many questions answered about how that happened. And then I add to all of that the conjecture that our ancestors, who started not only doing what many other animals do, namely moving objects around, thinking about how to move them, working out good ways of moving them, started noticing that they could abstract away from the actual objects that were being moved and just talk about the spatial structures and what the consequences are. For example, if you have something long and thin and you have something else that's long and thin, and then you move them in relation to each other in some way. And out of all of that, over hundreds or maybe thousands of years of human evolution, I don't know enough about the history, there developed a tradition in many, I think, in different parts of the planet, because I don't think this just happened in one place. It happened in various places in ancient Babylon, ancient India, ancient China, in addition to Egypt and Greece and places in Europe and so on. So those things led to the discoveries that we now know as geometry, but Euclidean geometry is only a subset of that. For example, there are things that Euclid did not include, which we're now familiar with. For instance, Euclid did not include reasoning about lines. As far as I know, Euclid didn't say anything about reasoning about lines moving around on the surface of an egg. He talks about straight lines or curved lines on a planar surface. But we can reason about more things than that. And if I ask you to think about a car tire, or tube rather, so you have a tube with a hole in the middle, and if I left you alone for a while to think about how many different kinds of continuous closed curves could you draw on such a tube. You can draw a little curve on the part of the surface of the tube, or you can go round the outside of the tube, or you can go around more than once. And if I left you to think about that, you might come up with an interesting answer to the question. How many different sorts of lines are there? When I say they're different sorts, lines that cannot be continuously changed into other lines because they're in a different class. You may make an interesting discovery, and I leave that for you to do in the bath or sometime later. But when humans are doing that kind of thing, at least the humans like me and the ancient mathematicians and many others that I've met, they are not doing what many current mathematical theorists do, which is try to capture all those notions in sets of axioms and definitions based on logic, and then show how all the conclusions can be reached by logical deduction. That's not what the ancients do. That's not what I learned to do at school. And although one can try to build a logic-based model of these ancient forms of reasoning, and that's a lot of that has been done, that's a different activity. And that is not what ancient people were using. So I'm now trying to make a lot of claims about a lot of different things, including bad features of our educational system. Sometimes on occasions like this, when it's real life, I ask people to put up their hands if they were taught geometry at school using the ability to prove things by drawing lines and so on. But I can't do that easily now. Maybe later we can find a way of taking a vote at some later stage. Anyway, where have I got to? Let's go back to this thing. So part of what I'm asking is whether the assembly machinery inside the egg that controls all those processes that I was talking about is something like a Maxwell demon, in the sense that, I don't know if you all are familiar with Maxwell's idea, was that in connection with the second law of thermodynamics, which said that disorder can only increase if you have things moving around in space and so on. And Maxwell postulated two boxes connected with a hole which could be opened or shut by a demon that was observing molecules bouncing around in the boxes. And he thought, well, if the demon noticed a fast-moving molecule going from left to right in the left-hand box, it opened the door, let the molecules through, and then shut the door. And likewise, if he saw a slow-moving molecule going from right to left, he'd open the door to let it through. But for other molecules, he'd leave the door shut and they'd bounce around instead. And that way, he suggested, without using any energy, if the door is opened and shut without friction, without using any energy, you'd be able to separate a collection of molecules in these two spaces into fast-moving and slow-moving, and that would violate the second law of thermodynamics. And there are various discussions of that and about fallacies and so on. And what I'm suggesting is that the processes that I'm talking about are a bit like Maxwell's demon. They are sitting there inside a very messy, unordered collection of molecules in the egg to start with, the white of the egg and the yolk of the egg and a few membranes, but it's pretty disordered. And out of all the processes that I'm talking about, one of the major results is that those molecules are completely rearranged, or the atoms and molecules, some of the molecules may have to be decomposed, are rearranged in a highly structured way, which puts Maxwell's demons task completely in the shade, because this is far more intricate, far more complex. And the question then is, does this, if it happens in something like the kind of way that I'm talking about, require some kind of, involve some violation of current fundamental physics of thermodynamics? Or is there some way of accommodating this? And I've been talking to physicist friends. I have an old former colleague from student days and so on, Tony Leggett, who hasn't yet said to me, you're talking nonsense, but he hasn't yet said to me, yes, this is plausible as a counter to the second law of thermodynamics. But I don't think he was able to join us today. I haven't seen him in the participants, but I would like to thank him for at least encouraging me to continue with this. And I'm be very grateful if anyone in this audience who has any ideas about this also joins in. And at that point, I think I should stop. I've got a lot of other stuff, but I could go on for far too long. Have I reached my time?
No, that's very good. This gives us a nice amount of time for questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, so should I stop sharing?
Yes, I think so.
Let's try that.
That's
and then
good.
I'll go back. Yeah.
And then you suggested the nice exercise of asking people how many of you have learned Euclidean geometry, using pencils and chalkboards and things like that. What we could do is ask people to go to the reactions and press the check button. There's a little check mark or an X.
Or raise a hand. And then come up in all the galleries.
Well, we can't see everybody. Okay. So if they do the reaction of the check mark, then right, I can count very quickly.
Okay, so I'll click that.
So the question is, how many of you have learned Euclidean geometry in the more traditional way, where you have to take out your pencil and
so go down to the reactions box and tick yes if you did. So I'm not the only one. I'm delighted to hear that.
So it's approximately half and half. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
I'm just cycling through them. Oh, Mike Ferguson. So a couple of names I know from my other contexts. Good.
Yeah. So it's about half and half. Half of your audience. Okay, so we'll now open up the floor to questions.
And criticisms and comments.
But Fawzat has a question.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the talk, Aaron. Wide-ranging and, as you mentioned, a wild ride, and I'm sure becoming wilder as it goes. I'm wondering whether you're familiar with recent research on the concept of the engram, E-N-G-R-A-M.
It's a name I've heard, which is supposed to be something in the genome that encodes information. Is that right?
It's an epigenetic concept. It goes back. I'll put it all in chat in a moment. It goes back to Richard, I think Semin back in 1904. Then it gets updated about 10 years ago with neurobiological and biochemical rigor. And this is about 10 years of mainstream attention to this, with titles like epigenetic programming, and let's see, transgenerational inheritance. These are other terms. Neuroepigenetic studies are being done recently with measurements of biochemical precision. And what these have focused on is the passage of memory and learning and skills of the type you're talking about transgenerationally. At this point, they've been able to measure and actually intervene in passing on of learning that a mother does to her chicks in one generation for certain, and a little bit faded, but in the second generation, in the grandchild of the mother, the same fear response to a particular frequency of sound has been demonstrated. And these are published in journals like Nature and so forth. So it's not exactly starting from the geometric basis that you've been talking about, but it does follow the same through line conceptually about how learning could be passed on. And this is not my field. I just have been interested in it a long time and was happy to see that some degree of precision has been brought to bear on it in a scientific, which is to say in a neurobiological context. And the fellow who's been convening meetings about this, I think maybe 6 years of this, is John Bickel. I'll just hit chat now. I just dumped this all into chat.
Okay, right.
John Bickel has convened several meetings annually at the University of, I think, Mississippi, down in the Gulf of Mexico area of the United States. And a huge number of papers have come out. I put in a couple of samples. They're not necessarily representative, but you can see where that's going. Anyway, that's all consistent with the kind of things you're saying, but really coming at it from the biochemical and neurobiological point of view. And I was surprised. I was very pleased because where I learned about this was Waddington, a student of Whitehead, a biologist, early 20th century, and then in other places which use this in other contexts, but I'd never seen it actually played out in a biochemical context. Anyway, there it is. Just wanted to know if you were aware of this, and if not, perhaps you would benefit from and enjoy reading these things.
Well, thank you very much. I've just copied your chat text into a file, which I may use later. But anyway, I knew some of that, and there's a lot of stuff that I used to know, and my brain's been going downhill. Unfortunately, it's often happens at my age, 85, and all kinds of little things are slipping away. Although for some reason I'm still able to have complex new ideas. I don't understand the combination of those two.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say was that what I've been focusing on in the last year and a half is not that fact, which as you point out, have been all the claims, those claims, and there are evidence supporting many of those claims. But I'm focusing now on the mechanisms, and partly because I suspect that there are things that go on in the brains of adult human mathematicians solving problems in geometry of the kind that I used to enjoy so much when I was at school. And I'm not the only one, many other people did, but which are no longer taught to our kids, which is dreadful. By the way, another person who thinks it's who thought it was dreadful was the inventor of fractals, Mandelbrot. He was a great geometer, and I heard him give a talk, I think around about 1993 or something, or I can't remember when it was. Might have been the beginning of the century at Warwick University. And one of his repeated themes is that our kids are not getting the proper education in geometry in school now, because they're instead taught logic and set theory and stuff, use of axioms, and not the ancient forms of reasoning. But anyway, the point I was going to make was I've been aware of those ideas, but I've got interested in trying to understand the mechanisms, because I think the mechanisms may be relevant to deep mistakes in current theories of intelligence, including, on the one hand, the people who say that it's all neural nets, and neural nets have to be trained by a lot of statistical evidence, and then you derive probabilities, the brain derives probabilities from those statistics, and then the probabilities are used. And that can never lead to a discovery that something's impossible or necessarily true. No amount of statistical evidence will show that something's impossible or necessarily the case. Impossible isn't a point on a scale of probabilities. It's in a different space altogether. Anyway, so I want to try to change or revive an older form of mathematical philosophy of mathematics, which in turn would feed into mathematical education, which has got huge gaps now. And I think the stuff about n-grams may be relevant to that, but it doesn't directly address the spatial reasoning bit. And as a side effect of that interest of mine, it wasn't something I originally expected when I got into thinking about eggs and so on. I came up with this notion that there might actually be a problem for fundamental physics in explaining the mechanisms that I'm talking about. If my crude analogy with Maxwell's demon is correct, namely that this thing is turning a relatively, the processes in an egg are turning a relatively unordered collection of chemicals in the goo in the egg. I mean, it's not totally unordered, but there's nothing like the structures that emerge a few weeks later with masses of intricate detail. And it's not just, a lot of different things in different places. They're interlocking and interconnected in all sorts of rich ways that seem to require kind of transfer of information about what's going on at different places in order to control what happens next. Anyway,
out on there,
yeah.
two other questioners, so maybe we should let them ask their question.
Yes, I go on too long. Yes.
Gustavo.
Well, Aaron, I must admit I understood little about your presentation.
I'm sorry,
Anyway,
I'm going to...
I have two questions that
I need to
perhaps regard just some preliminary aspects of your thesis. And one is, you claim that during evolution, a growing number of virtual machines has developed. I don't understand why you call these virtual. I understand that the number of machinery increases, but why are they virtual? Or do you call virtual any biological machine that is a mix of chemicals and structures? The second question is, why do you center your talk about hatching? So do you think hatching is a very special phenomenon in life, or it is just one and there are other transitions that must be explained? Think, for instance, the metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a butterfly.
Did you understand the questions?
I think so. I found the volume level a bit low, but I then managed to get it. On the first point, I think the thing that interests me is that, well, perhaps maybe you should make sure I've got this right. You're saying that there's no special reason for emphasizing chemistry or for emphasizing eggs. These are more general phenomena that other people have talked about.
It was more on the moment of hatching. Is the moment of hatching is it one of many phases, or is it a very particular, the biggest change in
it's just that it's an example about which I was able to collect some interesting evidence. And I'm sure that if we look closely at behaviors of many species, things that I know about orangutans and chimpanzees and chickens and ducks and young humans, I wonder, or I had a video of a child with a pencil doing things which to me were quite spectacular, but I won't bother with the video. But so there's lots of evidence of forms of spatial intelligence in humans and other species that are all relevant. But I'm also trying to understand what the mechanisms are that underpin those forms of spatial intelligence. And there are some people who think, oh, well, we just use logic all the time. I don't think you were claiming that. And I presume the people you were referring to weren't claiming that. So in that sense, there's no disagreement. It's just, I want to know what the mechanisms are. And I want to be able to understand whether we have the resources in artificial intelligence to replicate them. At the moment, I don't think we do have those resources because we have a combination of fake neural networks, mostly simulated, or in some cases maybe physiological ones, and then logic and algebra. And I don't think either of those two together can replicate the ancient forms of reasoning that I was talking about. And that raises the question, well, is there any way in which we can build machines other than by making more animals or more humans that can do those ancient kinds of reasoning? And I don't know the answer to that. I suspect the only ways that are possible are the ones that evolution has already discovered. And that would be interesting if true. But I think that was only one of your questions. And there was a second one.
The other one was about why call them virtual machines?
Oh, yes, that's
virtual.
right. I'm using the word virtual in the way in which it's been used gradually more and more generally in computer science since around the early 1960s. Originally, when the thing that was called a virtual machine was a program running on one computer simulating a future possible computer that was going to be built and it hadn't yet been built. And then later, more and more complex things happened on computers that did not involve being restricted to particular bits of mechanism inside the computer, particular locations. For instance, a process in a computer could sometimes be occupying one part of the computer physical memory, sometimes another part, or it could temporarily be moved to the disk and so on. And that got more and more complicated. And then later on, we started putting lots of computers together and processes came into existence that weren't located in any of the computers. And the Zoom process that we're all using now brings a whole lot of people together with a whole lot of connections. And there are no wires joining us to, person to person. There are no fixed connections. There are very active, highly complex things going on with signals being communicated and checked. And if there are failures, then corrective actions being taken. So the actual Zoom meeting that we're all sharing is a virtual machine whose implementation may be changing all the time in the physical world without our being aware of that at all. And of course, it changes if someone joins the group or leaves the group. So that notion of virtual machinery seems to me to be deeply important and not part of our normal education. And even computer scientists haven't understood how broad and deep the concept of virtual machine is that we now use in our everyday life. And I'm suggesting that some aspects of that kind of virtual machinery were discovered long ago by biological evolution, insofar as it could not use physical spatial manipulators to change things around in an egg. It had to do it in some other way by changing electric fields or whatever enables the controlling processes in eggs to move chemicals around. Does that sound like an answer to your question? Or
Thank you. Thank you for your explanation. I need to read more to understand something about that. Thank you very much for your explanation.
Well, we could come back to it later in discussion if other people are interested.
Okay, thank you. Xavier has a question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. It was very interesting. So mainly, I was thinking a little bit about, well, you explained now Euclidean mathematics in this case, but I am going more to language learning, and I don't know if maybe it's kind of a good comparison, because Chomsky said mainly that when we are born, we don't learn language, but we have mechanisms that actually made us understand the context of language where we learn. And we tend with years to forget how to learn other language because of the adaptations of the neurons. In that sense, I was thinking that perhaps the neural networks that we are using now in artificial intelligence are not good at all, but there are another models at least, which are for example, the Hopfield networks, which I think that they are not statistical at all. So I was thinking that maybe using this kind of networks and understanding Chomsky's formulations can bring us a little bit to what you suggest with Euclidean mathematics or something like that. So thank you.
Thank you. Language learning and development is a very interesting problem, and I have done a lot of work on that, and some of it has been in collaboration with a biologist at Birmingham University, Jackie Chappell. And we don't agree with Chomsky, and we don't agree with Chomsky's critics. We think that the situation is more complex than most people have realized. And I can try to give a very crude summary of the kind of view that Jackie and I developed, which is that there are aspects of a genome, and this doesn't only apply to language, it applies to various things, but it's absolutely crucial for language, that are what we call meta-configured. That's to say, the genome has things that are not fully specified. They're abstract, but they're not all the parts of the genome are expressed at the same time. Now, that is very obvious. For instance, there are many parts of the human genome that involve production of sexual physiological changes and changes in motivation, getting interested in the opposite sex and so on. And those happen relatively late in life. So it's clear that the genome, biological genomes have mechanisms for delaying gene expression. And those are examples. And there are many more. Now, what we came up with was the idea that some of those delay mechanisms make use of not specific genomes or genomic structures, which when they're expressed do something specific, but the genome having things that are expressed late, which are abstract. They have parameters, slots for parameters in them. And why is that important? Well, it means that if one of these genetic factors is expressed, say, when you're 5 years old, it may have access to information that the child has picked up in the first 5 years and stored in its memory and so on, which it would not have had in another culture or another time in human evolutionary social history. So that means that the late developing genome can use information that's relevant to a new complex situation that might not have existed in an earlier, for earlier generations, and then do things with that. And if that happens with several levels of abstraction, then you can find ways in which social and other developments, physical techniques, physical technologies, social practices, and all kinds of things that can vary from one place to another, which are themselves products of older people whose genes have been expressed and given them competences, and then they do things, and sometimes they do new things. The children growing up in that environment.
Sorry to interrupt, but Sophia also has a question, and we're going to run out of time.
The main thing is the meta-configured genome can produce enormously varied and enormously powerful new phenomena from generation to generation. And I think that I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just taking what I think you were saying to some further implications.
So let's hear the question from Sophia.
Thank you for the talk. I may be asking actually a very naive question, but it's specifically with respect to a virtual machine. I was wondering, what is the difference between virtual machine and causal mechanism? I mean, why we are assuming that egg before hatching or before whatever is happening in that egg is actually completely chaotic? Why we are assuming that? Because isn't it that we have causal mechanisms which can actually explain all those different aspects? And by causal mechanism, I do not mean something which is very deterministic. Rather, it's something which has a certain flexibility in itself. I don't know if I'm making sense.
I think I'm saying the same thing as you are, and I'm trying to relate it to mechanisms that provide the flexibility. So one of the ways in which a mechanism can provide flexibility is to be parameterized. And to vary according to the way it works, according to the circumstances. The circumstances provide parameters, which are then used in the way the mechanism behaves. And that's clear in the case of what I was saying about language. But I think that's a much more general phenomenon.
But then what is the why we call it Maxwell's demon?
So why do we call them?
Maxwell's demon.
Well, the Maxwell's demon bit comes from the fact that there is there's some sort of control going on inside the egg, which is manipulating or controlling what happens next at different stages, but that can't be done by something. Well, there are two aspects there. One is, why is that a virtual machine? It can't be done by putting in physical devices that go into the different parts of the egg and push things around. It has to be done in a different way. And by using virtual machines, I include using electromagnetic fields to cause things to move. But they have to be very precise. If you want to continue the development of a nerve fiber in a particular location, or make sure that two blood vessels, a vein and an artery, are going to meet in a particular place, that has to require quite precise control. But the egg controller can't be something that sends in new physical bits of machinery to move these things together. It has to be.
I'm afraid I'm gonna have to cut you off, and
Okay.
thank you for a very, very nice talk. And maybe during the break you can elaborate on this with
Sure.
with Safia, etc.
I'm happy to.
Thank you very much.